This message is brought to you by DoNotAge.org, the longevity research organisation that's on a mission to extend health span for as many people as possible via products that actually work. Start your journey today at DoNotAge.org and use code LLAMA for a 10% discount. That's LLAMA.
The way clinical trials are done, the recruitment is extremely narrow in scope, and the burden for their participants currently is extreme. Now, you decentralize that. You recruit through all avenues. You enable people to participate kind of across the country, across the world, and participate from their own home. I think that's really where we see research going.
Hello and welcome to the Live Long and Master Aging podcast. I'm Peter Bowes, and this is where we explore the science and stories behind human longevity. This week we're at the Global Body Computing Conference at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Now, much of what we talk about on this podcast is inspired by clinical trials, the grassroots scientific research that is so crucial to our understanding of the human body, the diseases that affect all of us, and the medical interventions, preventative and sometimes predictive, that influence our long-term health. Well, today I'm joined by Dr. Michelle Longmire, Stanford-trained physician, entrepreneur, and the founder of Medable, the digital format that's doing so much really quite groundbreaking work, making the world of medicine more accessible to all of us. Michelle, welcome to the LLAMA podcast.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
So tell me a little bit more about Medable. It's quite a unique concept.
Sure. So, Medable was really inspired by my work at Stanford, where I practiced both as a dermatologist and as a researcher. And in that, I understood that, the data that's limited to clinical visits, when patients come in and we're caring for them, or when you're conducting a clinical research project and you're limited to the data that's provided in a clinical visit, it's very much a snapshot of someone's health. And so the hypothesis and what we're really driving with Medable is a new paradigm called direct-to-patient. And this is, let's capture data for clinical trials and clinical care that's every day out and about in your real-world life and use that to inform our understanding of health and disease. And so that's really what we're pioneering.
So what kind of data are you talking of? What kind of data are you capturing?
Sure. So we're capturing, environmental determinants of disease, as well as those really important self-reported or patient-reported outcomes. So, what is the UV index? What is the urban air quality? What are the other emerging diseases in the area that you live? What are some of the socioeconomic factors or even weather pattern factors that may actually determine your health outcome? In combination with, depending on the disease condition or, area of study, how do you feel? What are you reporting? And then thirdly, the physiologic kind of continuous measurement of your life. So using sensors, both worn and in home, to capture that physiology continuously.
And the idea here is clearly everyone potentially benefits from the person providing the data. I nearly said giving up the data. I think that perhaps is the wrong phrase. It gives the wrong impression. But the person who has ownership of the data and those who are analyzing it.
Yeah, absolutely. What we are also pioneering is this concept called the digitome. And so very similar to the human genome, which is the genetic basis of our existence of the humankind, we believe that the digitome, digital signatures of health and disease, will be as informative and will help us understand health and disease better. And so, yes, there's certainly a population benefit to us capturing this information, but the value we provide is actually in enabling better clinical trials and enabling better clinical care. So examples, in immuno-oncology, we have this whole new domain of chemotherapy agents, or essentially drug therapies that leverage the immune system. And the immune system is highly influenced by our day-to-day life. So this contextual data, this continuous data, can really help us potentially even predict some of the adverse side effects or response to therapy. So I think there's direct value in clinical trials and also in clinical care and things like preventing readmissions post-operatively, a whole host of other areas.
And we hear a lot, obviously, these days about the value of big data.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger the data, I suppose, the better the experiment, because it stands to reason if you have 10 subjects versus 10,000, and you're averaging results, perhaps effects of a drug interaction or exercise or a diet, if you're seeing it across 10,000 people as opposed to just a small number, clearly it's more meaningful.
I think that's in general true, although I would say that small data is also important. So something, for example, of, do you feel better today versus yesterday can actually be far more informative than, say, accelerometer data for 6 weeks that's totally uncurated. So yes, what I think, though, what really kind of essentially resonates with me about what you said is that diversity in the data across a condition or across health is so important, especially as we look at personalized medicine. So, if we're determining that this medication is most efficacious in this particular genotype or this particular subset of the population, for us to have diversity in our clinical research and clinical care is so important. And for that reason, among many others, the bigger the data, the more representative the population is, and the more diverse it is, the better.
So let's just talk about clinical trials and how they operate, and perhaps with an audience in mind that hasn't had any involvement with the clinical trial. Clearly we hear about them a lot, we read them in the papers when there's a breakthrough clinical trial is concluded, and it suggests that. But as to how they work, I think it's a little bit of a mystery to a lot of people. I actually took part in a clinical trial as a subject myself a few years ago. It was looking at a fast mimicking diet. I've talked a lot about it on this podcast. It involved eating certain foods.
With Longo.
With Dr. Walter Longo, yeah, of course. And that was a very, let's say, labour-intensive clinical trial. It involved, from my perspective, eating the food and following the regime. But it also involves going for blood tests and other tests, scans, that kind of thing. You physically got to turn up. You've got to show up at the hospital or the centre, the research place, whatever it is, and go through that. And one of the problems, and not necessarily in this trial, but other trials involving similar labour-intensive behaviours, is people dropping out, people not keeping appointments, which can be very expensive.
Absolutely. So, this direct-to-patient model that we are really pioneering is both addressing recruitment and retention. So, recruitment, kind of first to address how does a clinical trial work, really only 3% of eligible participants ever enroll in a clinical trial. So even as a doctor in medical school and through my residency, and I trained at Stanford, very much a research-focused institution, we never learned as physicians how to inform a patient or enroll them in a clinical trial. It's just not a part of the clinical delivery kind of ecosystem. So there's a big problem in recruitment and us not leveraging clinical delivery of care. And I think when you go direct to patient, you're using social media recruitment. You're also using things like EMR integration to, in real time, understand when someone enters the healthcare system who would be eligible. So you are addressing this recruitment issue. But to your point about retention, so yes, now you're in a clinical trial. So let's say that you've been recruited by standard means, which is a doctor, who's an investigator on the trial, recruiting someone who happens to walk in that door, which obviously, as we know, in terms of receiving information, there are many new channels. We could recruit people far better. But about the participation. So you're going in there day after day. I mean, this study of fasting mimicking diet and Longo's work is a perfect example of where we could use direct-to-patient. You could imagine, instead of going into the clinic and doing the weigh-ins, the blood pressures, the blood assays, instead you wake up, you answer a couple of survey questions in your application, step on a Bluetooth connected scale. Some of our clinical trials even involve home finger prick to capture some of the blood data. And for them to be able to actually capture that physiologic data from you over the day. So not just that, every 2 or 3 weeks that you went in there. So I think when you look at the way clinical trials are done, the recruitment is extremely narrow in scope, and the burden for the participants currently is extreme. Now you decentralize that. You recruit through all avenues. You enable people to participate kind of across the country, across the world, and participate from their own home. I think that's really where we see research going.
Yeah, it seems to be a win-win situation for everyone, especially making it easier for the volunteers. And I think by their very nature, volunteers in a clinical trial are enthusiastic about the trial. They have almost a vested interest in the subject matter that's being tested. Nevertheless, it can become, especially if it's just trial over a long period of time, it can become quite a burden.
Absolutely. And I think it's not just a burden, it's also, can we understand this better? So I would hypothesize that if we did a direct-to-patient continuous clinical trial with the fasting mimicking diet, we may be able to develop a digital signature of aging. So we may actually be able to look at that physiologic data and provide you feedback on some time frame that says the things you did today are making you older faster. The things you did a week ago are actually making you older at a slower rate. And that's the kind of data that I think we really need to start making impactful interventions in things that are nebulous like aging.
That's really interesting because I think, and you could extrapolate that, there is technology now clearly that will tell us on a daily basis if we're doing something, let's say blood sugar, which we've actually heard about at this conference today. If you are constantly measuring your blood sugar, you can adapt your activities for a day based on, in terms of what you're eating, of what your blood sugar is telling you.
Absolutely. So we know in human behavior that immediate feedback can directly impact behavior. So, we know it with weight gain. People who step on the scale every day are far less likely to actually gain weight over time. We know that if you check your blood pressure, your blood glucose more continuously, you're going to make better choices in managing that. So yeah, kind of coming back to this concept of aging, where's the feedback system for that? And I mean, it's tangential to where we started this conversation, but I think that's really the power of kind of what we're doing as a company is we're engaging with people directly, capturing robust data sets, and then ideally providing that information directly back to them over time that can really influence those behavior choices.
Now, I'm very enthusiastic about this, and I think people listening to this probably are like-minded in that respect. However, there are still people who are unnervous when you talk about giving up data and sharing data, and I mentioned ownership of data earlier. Clearly, we're moving into a world where this is going to happen more and more often, and you can see why it's for the greater good. Equally, people, I think, want to be reassured that they don't have to do it if they don't want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we don't really change the paradigm of what an individual, what type of data it is, and how, or I guess I should say, what type of data is shared. So because you're collecting it, in your home, you're collecting it through devices, you're collecting it through an app, doesn't mean it's entering some wider data field. It's still going back to the pharmaceutical company. It's still going back to the hospital system. And we have just tremendous amount of infrastructure in place to ensure that that data is secure and it's going back to, those that are intended to. With that said, we do enable data donation and this broader de-identified ecosystem, but really, first and foremost, we ensure for every participant and patient that their data is very protected.
So talking about your company then, what are your big successes so far?
Oh, it's been fascinating. I mean, we're 3 years old, so it's kind of a new endeavor in general. And in each year, I think you begin to see, this kind of exponential gain in the progress that you've made. So we went from last year, having really 3 customers to this same time now last year to this year. Now we have 15 hospital systems, actually represents over 60 individual hospitals, and 3 large biotech companies leveraging our platform, that holistically representing the reach of our platform potentially to 15 million patients and 6,000 clinical trials. And I think, when we talk about what we're doing to investors and people, who are interested in looking at growth factors, how is your company growing? It's really impressive. People like, how can you have that many customers new in 1 year? Because usually selling to hospital systems is quite slow. But what we're doing, enabling doctors and researchers to capture this data directly, there's just a significant appetite for doing this.
And you mentioned earlier that when you were training as a doctor, you weren't given any instruction, any education on this kind of work in terms of clinical trials. It's interesting to me because I often talk to physicians, to doctors, in terms of diet, and they say, we didn't get any diet education at all. Or maybe we had 30 minutes talking about diet and the implications of diet. There was this seems to me, a lot lacking in traditional training of doctors. Maybe there still is.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, so in my training, I was trained about clinical trials, but that was simply because I was a researcher. So what I was kind of implying earlier was that the standard medical school curriculum, the standard residency program doesn't include that. But yeah, they think that in the training, of physicians, and there's definitely a focus on disease and a lack of focus on health. And in that, there's also a focus on, working within the current system, which is about delivering care and providing it there. And it's less about, looking at clinical trials, looking at how we can expand the scope and offering for that particular person, because it might be that the delivery of that care is far outside of that institution. So I think we do tend to become a little bit myopic.
And we'll continue this conversation in just a moment.
Hey, quick question for you. Are you someone who wants to be fit, healthy, and happy? And what if I told you you could get your dream body by simply just listening to a podcast? I'm Josh.
And I'm KG, and we're the hosts of the Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast.
Listen, we get it. Fitness isn't easy. Carbs, no carbs.
Just stop, okay? It doesn't have to be that complicated. And that's why we made this podcast. We get straight to the facts so you can become your best you.
So the way to check us out is click the link in the show notes or search Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. We'll see you soon.
Talking about specific diseases, and I think this perhaps obviously will resonate with so many people listening to this. When we talk about trying to do a huge, large clinical trial, collecting data, obviously there are diseases in mind that specifically people want to eventually see a cure for. And obviously I think cancer is the thing that would probably come first to mind, but there's heart disease, there's diabetes as well. Is there anything on your radar that this kind of research and data collection that you're talking about is particularly useful for?
Yeah, so my background as a researcher was in epigenetics. So this is really about how, the slate of genome that we're given from the time we're born is really influenced by the choices we make, the way we live, to really dictate our actual health. And so there are many diseases where the epigenome, really how we live, environmental determinants of disease, play a very significant role in disease. So these are things like schizophrenia, autoimmune disease, aging, where you can't say it's this one gene, it's this one thing that you did, this one exposure. It's really a confluence of things in the decisions we make. So I think capturing that data over time will help inform us what are the drivers of those diseases.
And you fall into the group of medical professionals who consider aging to be a disease?
Well, that's so interesting. I mean, I should say that it's certainly a condition. It's part of the human condition. It's also, interestingly, when you really look around, inorganic matter ages. Everything ages in, the space-time continuum that we live in here in this universe. But I do consider a condition. Certain people, it is a disease if you have progeria or other inherited forms of accelerated aging. I would say at this point, aging is a disease in over 50% of people because it's driven by life choices that can be modified to optimize their health, just like diabetes, prediabetes, heart failure, heart disease. And in a large number of people, aging really is a disease.
You mentioned life choices. In terms of your own life, how do you apply the knowledge that you have gleaned not only as a doctor but in your current line of work as well to your own life and your own longevity?
So, I think longevity has been such an interest of mine for many years. And in fact, I chose to go to Stanford to do dermatology, specifically to research longevity in this lab that I worked in, the lab of Howard Chang. And, so I've forever, since I can remember, made certain choices that I think were in the vein of like wanting to live a longer, healthier life and also look more young. So I remember when I was very young, my grandmother told me, sleep on your back. And to this day, I sleep on my back, and it's interesting, but you look, there's a whole world around Botox and fillers for preventing fine lines, so making choices like sleeping on your back actually affects your facial structure. One of my colleagues, Zakia Ramond, demonstrated that at Stanford in a study. So I'd say from the time I was young, I've tried to optimize my choices for a particular longevity outcome, knock on wood, but really not because I'm like, I want to live to 120, but it's just a very strong intellectual interest. So there's a satisfaction in doing that, in those choices.
So you sleep on your back. What about your diet and exercise regimes?
Yeah, so I believe that exercise really is the most potent thing we can do to prevent aging. The fasting data is also quite compelling, but mixed. But kind of coming back to exercise, we know that when we do brain imaging, that we have more brain volume and matter over time as we age with exercise. And I think that, when you look at the human brain, over 90% of kind of the function of the human brain is in the motor area. And we're really designed to move, both for mental health and physical health. So every day I pretty much religiously run for about an hour or do like high intensity cardiovascular exercise for an hour. And it's just kind of a core part of my regimen and how I live. From a diet perspective, I've experimented and done a number of the different kind of interventions for fasting, anywhere from a 5-day fast to the fasting mimicking diet.
You've tried it?
Yeah, I've tried it.
How did you get on?
Well, I've long followed this research, and so a friend and I actually have a number of kind of fasting hacks for smoothies and various like dietary methods for achieving FMD, and also just like low caloric intake over some period of time.
So that by that you mean you essentially create your own recipes,
right?
To try
so
to
we
mimic
took
the USC little white boxes.
Exactly. So they had the white boxes for the people in the studies here.
That's what I used.
Right, and then now I think they've commercialized that. But what we did is instead we took the fasting mimicking diet concept and we created a superfood version of it. So following the same protein, fat, and sugar breakdown of what you were trying to achieve over those 5 days, but doing it with things like, kale and so really kind of essentially micronutrient charged and antioxidant
Avocados.
Charged. Yeah. So I've done those things and I enjoy doing them intermittently. Just at the end of the day, the one thing I can say that I find is that if you fast 1 day a week, you feel your intellect is more powerful. You feel overall sharper.
At what point, and I fasted I did 36 hours on, so Sunday night to Tuesday morning of this week, and I know exactly what you're talking about. The effect is similar to the 5 days, even though it's a fast mimicking 5 days, so there is some food involved. But you get to that state, and I've talked about it many times, that sort of mental euphoria, that mental agility that you get to, which I think is what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing. I mean, you never realized you felt mentally slow before, but then when you have that kind of, you're in that state of the fast and you experience just that sort of mental acuity, you realize it is differentiated. So I think you can achieve that with a day fast, like with a 24-hour, 36-hour. I don't think you have to have the 5-day set. I think there are a number of ways, to achieving that. Now,
I think there are probably, and I'm sure you'll understand this better than I do, but there are longer term benefits of fasting for maybe 2 or 3 days at least in succession, that you get into a deeper state of fasting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that the research in this is really emerging, and you've probably interviewed people who are closer to some of the specific domains of this. But I think, autophagy and this whole concept that, when you're fasting, you're activating metabolic pathways that are a core part of, the way we are built as humans, or kind of our entire system and how we would optimally function from a cellular perspective.
And this is autophagy, the process of essentially throwing out those cells that are maybe old, not working properly, need replacing.
Well, it's specifically actually dealing with the protein aggregation that happens over time. And so basically in a standard life, we're eating all of the time and you're kind of constantly, in the state with like your foot on the accelerator. You're always pumping energy into the system. But when you fast, you actually now are activating, catabolic pathways or other pathways within the metabolism that are designed to kind of be in the repair, cleaning, housekeeping domain is the way we think about it. But there are really ways to harness internal energy stores rather than harness external energy stores to preserve and do all of the cellular functions we need. And what we're discovering is that in that fasting process, potentially, or in a starvation state, you actually can see activation of these pathways that lead to clearing out protein aggregates within the cell. And I think, Alzheimer's disease is a well-known example where you get protein aggregation. Now, I'm not saying it's because you've eaten too much food over time, but we do know that protein aggregation is a core part of aging. In terms of, what we see over time, and then it disrupts cellular function. So anyhow, fasting itself and what it triggers, as you're saying, if you do multiple days, you may be able to more deeply tap into some of those pathways that lead to kind of deeper cellular optimization and house cleaning and functioning.
And when you're not fasting, what kind of diet do you have?
And I can't say that, at this point I don't have a particular fasting regimen. I've done this for years, and I'm a very strong believer in my kind of athletic career, in a sense, from just a mental preservation. Like if I run every day, I can manage my company as a CEO. It's just a stress mitigation factor. But so I do fast fairly frequently. But in addition to the diet, so in terms of diet, what do I focus on? I mean, I love the cruciferous greens. I'm a big someone who loves to eat kale. There's interesting data emerging at looking some of the micronutrients there is very powerful anti-carcinogens. And I do think there's really strong data to show that the less meat you eat, the fewer types of cancer you have, or lowers your risk of cancer, I should say. And specifically, burnt, overly cooked meat is fairly well-established carcinogen at this point, specifically for colorectal cancer. So, I tend to eat more greens. I am a believer that humans are omnivores. And so I do eat that diet. I've also even tried...
So you eat some meat?
I eat some meat.
Some fish, maybe?
Yeah, primarily fish, and even then I think about you don't want too much heavy metal exposure. So you want to steer towards salmon, lower predatory, lower in the food chain in terms of fish. So yeah, I primarily eat greens. I eat a lot of fish, and I try to avoid red meat and excessively cooked red meat. But, I think I don't follow a specific regimen.
And clearly I can see your enthusiasm for what you do, but when you get out of bed every morning, what in terms of your work and your ambitions for the company, what drives you every day?
Well, I think that I've loved the process of discovery. And so on a day-to-day basis, we're driving towards enabling a new kind of paradigm of discovery. And it's just so exciting. When I look at how researchers are leveraging our technology, what diseases they're exploring, I can really see that I believe we're adding substantively to what will be discovered. And that is just the neatest process. Also, our team, interestingly, is very health focused. When you look at our office, we have, almost every kind of weight ball, exercise band you can imagine. So we actually do exercise together fairly frequently. So part of what gets me out of bed is just the opportunity to work with the people that I, have the chance to work with. And interestingly, in the vein of longevity, there was a study that was recently came out that showed that sometimes I worry, is the amount that I work and the amount of stress I have aging me? But there was recently a study that showed if you love your job, you can kind of handle this, burn the candle from both ends better. And
in terms of your own longevity, clearly you do think about this a lot, and you focus on issues, diet, exercise, and I guess you think about what could be in 50 years' time, in the decades ahead, what kind of person you want to be. When you do that, what is in your mind? What's uppermost in your mind in terms of how you want to grow old?
I think agility is probably the first word that comes to mind. So this would both be mental agility and physical agility. I think what I believe, we kind of represents youthfulness is the ability to understand rapidly and physically perform, to your physical capability and potential. And agility is something you do see being lost over time with aging. So whether it's slower understanding, the slower adoption of new technologies or new processes in life, and physically loss of agility, loss of flexibility, loss of the use of your body. So I would hope that I can maintain my agility in those domains to the best of my ability.
And the reason, I'm often asked this, the reason for wanting to live a long life. Why keep on living? Do you have a theory on that? Or do you have a philosophy on that?
I think when you enjoy and love what you do and you feel like, I think many people make really important contributions, but it's about the fact that we're doing something unique, and I'm really driven to kind of continue to further that. It's about really what you want to do, and that, understanding that if you weren't there doing it, that would be a loss in terms of where you see to be an important contribution. So I think that's a driver, as is, just the standard things of, you want to enjoy, see your family, see more places, all of those kind of hedonistic, sort of joyful, driven, desires that one wants in their lifetime. But I think more than length to me is really quality. And I believe those tend to go hand in hand.
It's a fascinating subject, and I agree with so much of what you say, especially in terms of aspirations and why we should want to live a long and healthy life. It seems to make so much sense.
What drives you primarily?
Well, you've actually listed some of those hedonistic reasons that you want to keep on living, to keep on enjoying life. I have this, and maybe this is the journalist in me, wanting to see what happens next.
Right.
And whether that's what happens next on the global stage or what happens next in terms of the scientific developments in food and diet and things that really interest me. I kind of want to be around to see it and then apply it to myself if I'm able to do that. So I think for all of those reasons, and I always say the alternative isn't particularly exciting to living long and healthy. So I think there are lots of good, positive reasons. And I think to the greater good, if we can focus on being healthy for as long as we can, think of the money that will be saved in health systems around the world and money that could perhaps be put into combating those diseases that really there's little we can do at a personal lifestyle level to change, but a bit of good, solid, well-funded scientific research might one day cure pancreatic cancer or some of those really challenging issues.
Yeah, that's very well stated, and I think that it's a great point. So many quality days lost, a lot of money going into potentially preventable and long-term kind of chronic suffering. So I think it's a good, kind of vision that we live these long, healthy lives.
Dr. Michelle Longmire, I've really enjoyed this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
And that's it. Just before we go, if you subscribe to the podcast and download automatically every week, I'm very grateful to you. You could also take a look at our website, Live Long and Master Aging. We have a new and refreshed look. You can search through our back catalogue of interviews. You can listen to the Dr. Walter Longo interview that I think was episode 1 and hear all about his side of fasting mimicking diets. There's a link to get in touch with the podcast as well. We're at lamapodcast.com. That's LLAMA podcast.com. You can also contact us via social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at Lama Podcast. Many thanks for listening. Health optimization is what this podcast is all about, and that means taking care of our mitochondria, the energy centres of our cells. Physical strength, avoiding frailty is key, and that's why the science behind urolithin A and the work of Timeline Nutrition is so interesting. You can find out more and get a discount code at our website and in the show notes for this episode.